The first time I saw him, he wasn't a dog. He was a shadow pressed against the rusted iron bars, a trembling shape coated in grime and asphalt, his fur matted like black tar. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of burnt rubber and rust, and the afternoon sun caught in the jagged edges of the cage, turning every corroded surface into a silent accusation. He lifted his head slowly, eyes dull yet blazing with a quiet, impossible plea, and I swear, even through the thick grime, I saw a spark of recognition, a flicker of hope that said, "Please don't leave me here." I froze, unsure if I should move closer, unsure if the world had ever prepared me to meet suffering so raw and personal. The asphalt that clung to his paws crunched faintly as he shifted, tiny movements echoing a lifetime of neglect, each one a whisper of a story no one had bothered to hear. Around us, the wind carried a mix of dust, rust, and decay, and for a moment it felt like time itself had stopped. I reached out instinctively, my fingers hovering over the cold metal bars, and in that instant, I realized rescue isn't just about removing someone from danger. It's about believing they can still be saved, even when the world has spent years proving otherwise. The cage waited like a wound at the edge of the abandoned lot, half swallowed by thorny weeds and tangled vines. The metal was crusted with rust, jagged edges curling like the remnants of old scars, each link screaming neglect. A thin shaft of sunlight struck the bars at just the right angle, illuminating a shadowed form inside. He was there, a small shape curled on itself, coated in blackened grime and patches of hardened asphalt that clung to his fur like a second skin. He did not move at first, or maybe he had not moved in years. It was impossible to tell where exhaustion ended and fear began. The air was thick with the stench of decay, metallic and bitter, mingled with the acrid scent of burnt rubber, each inhale a reminder that life can persist in the harshest of places. I knelt at the edge of the cage, careful not to startle him. He lifted his head slowly, as if the act of moving had cost him something vital. His eyes were a dark, luminous pool, dull yet piercing, and in them I saw something I wasn't prepared for. Recognition. Not recognition of me, but of possibility, the faintest spark that whispered, "Maybe this isn't the end." My chest tightened. My hand hovered over the cold, corroded metal, fingers trembling with the impulse to reach through, to touch, to reassure. But the cage was not merely metal. It was a barrier of years, of apathy, of quiet cruelty, and I had no right to assume my presence meant safety. Every movement he made was measured, deliberate. The faint crunch of hardened asphalt under his paws echoed in the still lot. He flinched at each sound, each shadow, each whisper of wind through the weeds. His ribs were visible beneath clumps of fur, spine curved like a question mark. I could almost count the years of neglect in the way his body had learned to survive in the smallest possible space. Yet there was also resilience there. Even now, he stirred at the faintest hint of human attention, muscles coiled like springs, waiting for permission to trust. I crouched lower, letting the weight of my presence be steady, silent. Around us, the world was a study in contrast, the cage rigid and cold, the weeds brittle and sharp, the sunlight warm yet incapable of softening the hard lines of neglect. A crow cawed from the distance, the sound harsh and jarring, and he flinched, ears pressed flat. I whispered his name quietly, though I did not know if he had won, though I did not know if he would ever respond. Still, I spoke, filling the silence with words I hoped were gentle enough to bridge the divide. Time stretched thin. Minutes became hours in the liminal space between fear and tentative connection. He shifted slightly, the clinking of rusted metal following him like a reluctant echo. My heart followed his rhythm, each tremor of his body registering in my chest, each wary glance a conversation without sound. He sniffed the air, cautious, alert, measuring me as much as I measured him. I realized that rescue is not an event. It is a process. It begins with observation, with patience, with recognition of the unseen scars that govern behavior. His body bore the physical scars, matted fur, hardened asphalt, gaunt limbs, but his eyes told of wounds far deeper, betrayal, loneliness, repeated lessons in mistrust. The sun began to dip, casting long, distorted shadows over the cracked asphalt beneath the cage. Tiny insects clung to the rust, their delicate bodies flickering in the dying light. Rain threatened on the horizon, clouds dark and swollen, smelling of ozone and wet earth. I watched him breathe, shallow and uneven, each exhale visible in the cool afternoon air. And I felt an aching empathy that made my hands shake. It was unbearable, this mixture of vulnerability and endurance. He had survived this long against odds I could barely comprehend, and yet he had endured without the warmth of human care, without a voice to comfort or a hand to soothe. I tried to imagine his life before the cage, before the asphalt hardened into fur, before neglect became routine. Perhaps there was a time when he ran freely, ears flapping in the wind, tail high with joy. Perhaps someone had loved him once, or perhaps he had never known warmth at all. Either way, the current reality pressed in with suffocating weight. And still, despite everything, he lifted his head again, eyes meeting mine with a tentative, fragile awareness. It was an appeal not just for help, but for recognition, for someone to see him as more than the residue of neglect. I extended a hand slowly, knuckles brushing the jagged bars. He flinched as I had expected, muscles tensing like coiled wire. But he did not retreat. Tiny movements, subtle shifts forward and back, measured each gesture with the precision of survival. There was a dialogue forming, my patience against his instinctual fear, my words against his silence. Each small glance, each tremor of his paws, each faint wag of a tail buried under grime was a story unfolding. Wind stirred the weeds around the cage, carrying the faint scent of rain and something sweet, maybe a hint of soil, of life still pulsing somewhere beyond the cage. He inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, ears twitching, body rigid with tension. I whispered again, a stream of soft, incoherent words, hoping the sound of my voice might pierce the barriers built over years. And in that silence between words, in that moment that felt suspended outside time, he moved closer to the bars. One paw, sticky with asphalt, touched the space between my fingers. Hesitance, searching, fragile. It was enough. A connection had begun. Not trust, not fully, but a fragile acknowledgement of possibility. He could have turned, run, disappeared into shadows, but he stayed. We were two beings measuring each other, negotiating the first tenuous threads of hope. The world continued around us, indifferent, the distant hum of traffic, the caw of the crow, the promise of rain. But for those moments, nothing else existed. Only him, only the cage, only the fragile thread bridging despair and possibility. And as I sat there, hand hovering over jagged metal, eyes locked on his, I understood a simple truth. Rescue begins not with action, but with recognition. To see, truly see, a life burdened by neglect and fear, and to acknowledge that it matters, that it deserves to exist, that it can be more than asphalt, rust, and shadows. For the first time he lifted his head fully, eyes bright enough to catch the dying sunlight, and I whispered softly, "I see you. I promise I will not leave you here." The cage remained cold and unyielding, but between us, something fragile and vital had begun to grow. The possibility of trust, the faintest spark of hope, the very first breath of rescue. The day after I first saw him, the cage seemed even more oppressive. The sunlight no longer offered warmth. It merely highlighted the jagged edges of rust and the grime that clung to him like a second skin. He lay in the same corner, body curled into itself, paws tucked beneath him, eyes tracking every movement I made with wary precision. The asphalt stuck stubbornly to his fur, black like shadows he carried everywhere, a permanent reminder of every moment he had been left behind. My stomach twisted as I knelt again, hands hovering over the cold metal. Unsure how to bridge the invisible wall of fear that separated us, I whispered softly, letting my words fall into the still air around the cage. "It's okay," I said, even though I wasn't sure he would understand. My voice was a fragile threat, the sound of care I hadn't dared to offer before. The tension radiating from him was almost palpable, a coiled spring of instinct and survival. I realized in that instant that trust would not be demanded, it would have to be earned. Painstakingly, in inches and seconds, through patience I had never fully practiced before. I extended my hand slowly, knuckles brushing the corroded bars. The metal was sharp, jagged in places, but my fingers lingered, hovering as if acknowledging the barrier itself. He flinched violently, eyes wide, muscles taut, but he did not retreat completely. There was a hesitancy in his stance, a fine balance between fear and curiosity. I could see his mind racing, calculating whether I was a threat, whether the possibility of care was real. And then, almost imperceptibly, he inched forward, nose twitching, paws shifting on the rough concrete, fur catching the light in jagged glimmers of black and brown grime. The connection, fragile as spider silk, began to form in that moment. One paw, small and coated in hardened asphalt, reached through the bars, brushing my knuckles. It was barely a touch, almost accidental, yet it carried the weight of years of longing, of unspoken pleas. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. Every tremor of his body resonated through me, a conversation without words, a dialogue stitched together by breath, movement, and instinct. Around us, the world was a quiet, indifferent witness. Distant traffic hummed, leaves rattled gently in the wind, a bird cawed somewhere far above. All of it blurred into insignificance, as though the universe itself had narrowed to the space between his paw and my fingers. I spoke again, voice soft, low, coaxing, letting my words weave a fragile bridge over his mistrust. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here." There was no response, no overt sign that he comprehended, yet the faint twitch of his ears, the slight shift of weight forward, told me he was listening, processing, measuring me against every human who had hurt or abandoned him before. It was a delicate negotiation. One misstep, one impatient motion, and I could lose him entirely. The afternoon passed in this liminal space, time stretching in long, heavy minutes. Sunlight softened, shadows lengthened across the cracked asphalt, and the air carried the scent of damp earth, distant rain, and something faintly sweet, like new growth pushing through decay. He sniffed cautiously, stepping a fraction closer, every movement a study in caution and instinct. I mirrored him, keeping my movements slow, measured, letting him dictate the pace. Rescue, I realized, is not a race. It is a conversation conducted in gestures, breaths, and moments suspended in time. Hours slipped by. I spoke in whispers, letting my voice flow over him like a gentle stream. "You don't have to be afraid. You're safe now." He tilted his head, eyes flicking to me with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. That single glance was victory enough. It told me he was willing to consider the possibility that safety could exist outside the rusted bars. My hand shifted slightly, fingertips brushing through the cold metal again, and this time he leaned in ever so slightly, nose brushing my skin through the narrow gap. A shiver ran through me, not of cold, but of awe at the fragile, tentative trust forming between us. The cage, once a symbol of despair, began to feel less permanent in that moment. It remained a physical barrier, jagged and cruel, yet it had softened somehow, under the weight of our silent dialogue. I could almost imagine it as a threshold, not a prison, a space that might one day be left behind entirely. He was teaching me patience, humility, and the quiet, painstaking art of earning another being's confidence. Rain began to fall lightly, misting the air with wet scent and the promise of change. The first drops touched his fur, darkening the asphalt clinging to him, and he shivered instinctively. I knelt closer, speaking softly, letting the sound of my voice become a rhythm, a steady heartbeat in the storm. His eyes found mine again, and in that gaze I saw not just fear but a spark of something I hadn't expected: curiosity, hope, perhaps even longing. He was testing me, and in that mutual examination a fragile bond began to emerge. Hours turned into evening, the light fading into shades of deep gray and gold. He leaned closer through the bars, muzzle brushing my hand, small whimpers escaping his throat. I whispered back, words tumbling over each other, a mixture of promises and apologies, confessions and assurances. I could feel the tension in his body begin to ease, tiny fractions of muscle relaxing, paws stretching slightly, tail flicking once, faintly, almost invisible but undeniably present. And then, as twilight settled over the lot, he did something extraordinary. He lifted one paw entirely through the bars, placing it squarely in my palm. Asphalt and grime coated it, rough and stubborn, yet I held it gently, letting him know that contact would not hurt, that human touch could be safe. That single hesitant gesture carried decades of unspoken pain and longing. It was a declaration: I am ready to trust just a little, just enough. I sat back slightly, letting him withdraw on his own terms, and watched as he curled once more in the corner, body tense but calmer. We had begun something that could not be undone, a fragile trust forming in the space between fear and hope. Around us, the night deepened, the wind rustling through weeds, distant sounds of life continuing on, indifferent yet present. And in the quiet, I realized that rescue is not a single act. It is an accumulation of these small moments. A paw extended, a whisper of reassurance, a breath held in patience and empathy. I left him there that night, promising silently that I would return, that I would not abandon him like the world had. As I walked away, the cage looked less like a prison and more like a challenge. One I was determined to meet, one that required patience, persistence, and the quiet courage to believe that trust could be rebuilt, brick by brick, paw by paw. And in the darkness, I felt the faintest flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable, that he might one day step out of the shadows and into the light. The day of the rescue arrived in muted chaos, as though the world itself held its breath in anticipation. The cage waited, as it always had, looming like a silent sentinel at the edge of the lot. Its rusted bars glinted dully in the pale morning light, edges jagged and uneven, catching the low sun like the teeth of some ancient trap. The dog was there, as always, huddled in his corner, body pressed close to the metal, coated in the stubborn residue of asphalt and grime that no rain or wind had yet managed to wash away. His eyes flicked toward me, wary, calculating, but also just faintly curious. I could sense the tension coiled within him, muscles taut, spine curved, every nerve attuned to survival. I knelt beside the cage, hands brushing lightly over the cold metal, and spoke softly. "We are going to get you out of here today," I whispered, voice almost swallowed by the wind through the weeds. He flinched, ears flattening, but did not retreat. There was a tension in the air, electric and fragile, a silent dialogue between us, filled with years of hurt and the faintest glimmer of hope. I took a deep breath, fingers gripping the corroded bars as I examined the cage. It had resisted time and neglect alike. Bending the metal would take patience, force, and a careful dance to avoid frightening him into retreat. The first contact was tentative. My hand hovered near his paw, inches from the hardened asphalt that had fused to his fur. He recoiled slightly at each movement, but then, almost imperceptibly, inched forward again, testing me, gauging my intentions. I whispered reassurances, letting my voice carry warmth, stability, and the promise of care. Rescue, I realized, is not about strength alone. It is a negotiation, a measured process of earning trust through consistency, patience, and empathy. Each inch of approach was a victory, each small contact a step away from fear and toward possibility. Working the cage was brutal. Rusted hinges groaned and screeched with protest as I pried, twisted, and leveraged every weakness I could find. Sweat mingled with rain and dirt, coating my skin in the same grime that covered him. He whimpered at the sounds, a high trembling note that cut through the metallic clang like a shard of memory. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each echo of metal against metal, a reminder that one false move could undo all the progress we had made. Yet he did not flee. He stayed, muscles coiled, eyes wide, watching, listening, measuring. I could see the internal struggle etched across his body, instinct warning him to escape, trust compelling him to remain. The asphalt on his paws was thick and unyielding. Each attempt to touch it was met with flinches and subtle withdrawals. I worked slowly, using warm water and gentle scraping, coaxing it away without causing pain, whispering every step of the way. "It's okay," I said over and over, soft syllables meant to anchor him, to remind him that the world could be gentle. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the asphalt began to loosen, clumps falling into the wet soil beneath us, leaving raw, tender skin underneath. I could see it, the resilience beneath the layers of grime, the life that had been suppressed but never extinguished. The sun broke through clouds briefly, casting golden light over the scene. Each drop of rain on his coat glimmered like black diamonds, and I realized that even in decay and neglect, there was beauty, fragility, and unspoken strength. I kept my movements slow, letting him dictate the pace. Every inch forward, every reluctant contact was a victory. Rescue, I understood more clearly now, is not a single act. It is an accumulation of small triumphs, painstakingly earned through patience and care. He shivered as I lifted him gently, cradling his trembling frame against my chest. The weight of his body was surprisingly light, yet it carried the mass of years of fear, pain, and neglect. He pressed close, muzzle tucked against my shoulder, breathing shallow, trembling not from cold alone, but from the sudden exposure to kindness. I could feel every heartbeat through his chest, a rhythm that had survived impossible odds. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of wet earth and asphalt, and the distant hum of traffic seemed inconsequential, irrelevant to the enormity of the moment. We stepped out of the cage, together. His legs were wobbly, paws slick and raw, yet he moved forward, leaning into my guidance. I could see him studying the world around him, eyes flicking from puddles to shadows to the far edge of the lot, cautious yet curious. The freedom he had been denied for so long was now tangible, yet terrifying in its novelty. Each step required trust. Trust in me, trust in the world, trust that the past did not define his future. And with every hesitant step, that trust grew, tiny victories building upon one another, a mosaic of hope forming in the ruins of neglect. The first night outside the cage was quiet and tense. I wrapped him in a warm blanket, letting him settle beside me. He did not sleep immediately, ears twitching at every sound, eyes scanning, body coiled like a spring ready to flee. I sat beside him, voice soft, recounting memories, stories, promises. Slowly, his body began to relax, the tremors easing, muscles uncoiling. He laid his head on my lap, tiny whimpers still escaping, but a profound shift had occurred. The world no longer threatened him at every turn. At least for this moment, there was safety, warmth, and the gentle consistency of care. Over the next hours, I observed him closely. Every small movement was a revelation. Tail flicks, tentative sniffing, the first hesitant exploration of the floor around him. The asphalt residue was still visible on patches of fur, but it no longer defined him. His eyes reflected something I hadn't expected. Curiosity. A quiet intelligence, a spark of life unbroken despite years of confinement. I whispered softly, voice low and steady, letting him know that he could begin to relax, that he could begin to experience joy without fear. And slowly, ever so slowly, he leaned into the warmth, pressing closer, breathing more evenly, letting go of the past just enough to inhabit the present. By morning, he had claimed small victories, stepping fully onto new ground without retreat, sniffing freely, testing boundaries with gentle confidence. Every glance he cast my way carried recognition, trust, and a tentative understanding that rescue is not fleeting. It is enduring, built in moments, reinforced by patience and consistency. The cage was behind us, yet its memory lingered in the arcs of his body, in the shadows under his eyes, in the trembling of his paws. But each step forward, each hesitant movement, was a reclamation, a shedding of the asphalt and ash that had weighed him down. And in that quiet dawn, as sunlight spilled over the lot, glinting on puddles and scattered debris, I realized that true rescue is not merely the act of liberation. It is the slow, deliberate process of coaxing life back into someone who has been denied it for too long. He was not free in mere body alone. He was beginning to feel freedom in spirit, in trust. I whispered softly, letting my voice become a rhythm, a steady reassurance that each step was safe, he began to understand the rhythms of this new life, the safety inherent in the presence of someone who would not abandon him. He allowed his body to relax in ways that had seemed impossible days ago, tail wagging subtly, ears lifting, eyes brightening. The transformation was not instantaneous. It was incremental, measured in tiny victories that accumulated into something profound. Each day he grew bolder, yet always in his own time. I learned to watch without interfering, to offer comfort without force, to honor the autonomy of a creature who had spent years powerless. The grass beneath his paws, the sun on his back, the gentle brush of wind through his fur, all of it became lessons in living, lessons in trust, lessons in hope. By the end of the week, he approached me freely, tail wagging, ears relaxed, eyes bright with curiosity. He allowed touch without hesitation, nudged for attention, and even displayed the faintest playfulness, pawing at leaves and chasing his own shadow. The first steps toward light were complete, not in a dramatic act, but in the quiet, persistent reclamation of self. The cage was behind him, the asphalt and ash shedding from his body, and with each passing moment, he became more fully himself, alive, aware, and unburdened by fear. And as I watched him settle beneath the fading sunlight, breathing calmly, tail twitching in subtle delight, I understood the truth I had glimpsed in fragments before. Freedom is not just physical. It is sensory, emotional, spiritual. It is the ability to trust, to explore, to experience life fully, without the constant weight of trauma pressing down. He had begun to understand this, and in turn, I began to understand it as well. Rescue is not a single moment. It is the patient tending of hope, the cultivation of trust, and the quiet witnessing of life reawaken. In the soft light of evening, as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, he curled beside me, no longer trembling, no longer pressing against imagined barriers. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that he was not just surviving, he was beginning to live. The first steps toward light had been taken, and they were irreversible. The world, once harsh and unyielding, was slowly becoming a place of possibility, warmth, and belonging. The field stretched before us like a promise, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sun. Grass swayed gently in the breeze, dotted with wildflowers, and the air carried the faint perfume of earth, leaves, and distant rain. He stood at the edge of it, tail low, ears alert, eyes wide as if the vastness of space itself threatened to overwhelm him. But there was no cage, no asphalt, no rusted bars, only open ground, the wind on his fur, the possibility of motion unrestricted. He sniffed cautiously, each step tentative, paws sinking slightly into the soft earth. And then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted, testing the boundary of fear against curiosity. I followed at a distance, letting him set the rhythm, letting him explore without interference. Each cautious step was measured, deliberate, yet beneath it lay a burgeoning confidence. The light danced across his coat, highlighting the subtle sheen that had returned as the grime and asphalt were washed away. His body, once coiled with tension, began to stretch and flex in ways I had never seen. Muscles eased, ears flicked freely, tail lifted ever so slightly. Each movement radiated a quiet triumph, an unspoken declaration that freedom, long denied, was his to claim at last. He ventured farther, sniffing the wildflowers, ears flicking at the distant song of birds, nostrils flaring at every new scent. For the first time, he seemed to measure the world not as a threat, but as a tapestry of possibility. He paused by a shallow stream, peering into the water's reflective surface, whiskers twitching. Hesitation hung in the air, a final echo of the fear that had defined his past. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, he leapt forward, paws splashing into the cool current. Water sprayed around him like shards of sunlight. His ears flopped, tail wagged, and a faint, joyful whimper escaped his throat. He breathed deeply, chest rising and falling, eyes scanning the horizon, and I understood fully the journey he had made. From the shadows of a rusted cage, from the asphalt and ash that had weighed him down, he had emerged not just alive, but fully himself. The freedom he had earned was more than movement. It was confidence, trust, joy, and belonging. It was a life reclaimed from neglect, nurtured with patience, and transformed by care. As we walked back, side by side under the first stars of night, he glanced up at me, eyes reflecting the soft silver of moonlight. There was no fear in those eyes, only recognition, gratitude, and the quiet contentment of a being who had been given a second chance. I whispered softly, words meant to honor both our journeys. "You are free now. You are safe. You can live." He pressed closer, tail wagging slowly, as though acknowledging the truth of every word. And in that moment, I realized the profound truth of rescue. It is not only about saving a life, it's about restoring possibility, illuminating hope, and witnessing the reawakening of spirit. The dog who had once been a shadow in a cage was now an expression of life itself, radiant, confident, and wholly present. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality we shared, a story written in pause, breath, and trust. The night air carried the scent of grass, earth, and lingering sunlight. The field, once vast and intimidating, had become a sanctuary, a place of renewal and joy. He curled beside me beneath the sky, breathing softly, contentedly, each rise and fall of his chest a quiet affirmation of life reclaimed. I felt a swell of gratitude and awe, not just for his survival, but for the journey we had undertaken together. A journey from despair to hope, from confinement to freedom, from fear to trust. And as I watched him drift into sleep, tail twitching in dreams, chest rising and falling with steady rhythm, I knew that this was more than rescue. It was rebirth. A shadow had transformed into light, asphalt and ash into vitality, rust into resilience. He was no longer defined by the past. He was defined by the courage to trust again, the strength to move forward, and the quiet, radiant joy of being truly free.